It was on Patmos that John received the visions recorded in Revelation. The emperor had sent him into isolation. But isolation became the setting for a message that would outlive the empire. Domitian could control an island. He could control soldiers. He could control prisons. But he could not control the message John carried. And that is the strange irony of persecution. Sometimes, the attempt to silence a witness makes the witness louder. But John was not the only person caught in the storm. Flavia Domitilla was another. She belonged to an influential Roman family. Yet tradition remembers her as a Christian who suffered exile. Her status could not protect her. Imagine leaving everything behind: your home, your family, your possessions, your position, and walking into exile because you refused to abandon your faith. For Domitian's victims, exile itself could become a form of slow suffering. And then there were the unknown Christians, people whose names history never preserved. Their stories were not written in imperial records. Their graves may have disappeared. Their families may have forgotten the exact place where they died. But their suffering was real. They were the people who disappeared quietly. The fisherman, the merchant, the widow, the servant, the father, the mother. Ordinary people, caught inside an extraordinary storm. Then came another name: Timothy, the beloved disciple of Paul, the bishop associated with Ephesus, an elderly servant of the Christian community. And according to Fox, his final confrontation happened during a pagan festival. The festival was loud. The streets were crowded. Idolatrous images were carried through the city. People shouted. Music filled the air. And Timothy saw what he believed was an assault against the worship of the true God. So he confronted the procession. His words angered the crowd. At first, they shouted. Then they surrounded him. Timothy stood alone. And suddenly, the celebration became violence. According to Fox's account, the crowd attacked him with clubs. Again and again, the elderly Christian leader fell beneath the assault. But even here, we must separate tradition from established history. The New Testament does not record Timothy's death. The later traditions do. And those traditions differ about exactly when and how he died. So this part of our story should be remembered as tradition, not unquestionable fact. But the central message remains powerful. Whether in Rome, Jerusalem, Ephesus, or the remote island of Patmos, Christians were learning that following Christ could demand extraordinary courage. And that is what makes Domitian's era so frightening. The danger did not always announce itself. Sometimes, it came as a whisper, an accusation, a summons, a knock at the door, a demand to swear an oath, and then a sentence. Imagine lying awake at night, hearing footsteps outside. You don't know who they are. You don't know who informed them. You don't know whether they came for your neighbor or for you. Then comes the knock. One knock. Silence. Another knock. Silence. Then the door begins to shake. The family knows. There is no time to escape. The empire has found them. This is the terror behind persecution. Not knowing. Waiting. Hearing footsteps. Watching your loved ones tremble. Knowing that one accusation could destroy everything you have. And yet, the Christians continued. They gathered. They prayed. They taught their children about Jesus. They shared what little they had. And they passed the faith from one generation to another. That is the part Nero had failed to understand. And perhaps Domitian failed to understand it too. You can imprison a person. You can exile a person. You can destroy property. You can even kill a person. But killing a person does not automatically kill a conviction. Domitian's power eventually ended. The emperor who demanded worship could not worship himself forever. His reign collapsed. His enemies returned. And the man who had terrified others would eventually face his own mortality. Domitian was assassinated in AD 96. The emperor was gone, but the Christians remained. The prisons emptied. The exiles waited. And the church continued. And that is the strange tragedy of persecution. The persecutor often believes, I will end them. But history sometimes answers, you only made their story unforgettable. But there is something else we must remember. History is not always simple. Fox wrote centuries after these events. Later Christian writers preserved traditions. Some stories became more dramatic with time. And modern historians continue to debate the scale of Domitian's persecution. There is no surviving Roman law that clearly says, kill every Christian. The evidence is more complicated. But individual Christians and people associated with Judaism did face accusations, exile, confiscation, and death during this period. And that suffering should not be forgotten. Because behind every historical debate, there were human beings, people who experienced fear, people who lost homes, people who watched loved ones disappear, people who wondered, will I be next? And perhaps that is the most important thing about these stories. The martyrs were not superheroes. They were human beings. They felt fear. They loved their families. They wanted to live. But when forced to choose, many chose Christ. That is why their stories still matter. Not because suffering is beautiful. It isn't. Not because death is something we should desire. It isn't. But because their lives force us to ask, how much does our faith really mean to us? Would we still believe? If believing cost us comfort, would we still confess Christ? If confession cost us our possessions, would we still stand? If standing meant losing everything? Domitian wanted submission. The Christians offered conviction. He had an empire. They had faith. He had soldiers. They had prayer. He had the power to take their lives. But he could not take their hope. The emperor disappeared. The soldiers disappeared. The informers disappeared. The crowds disappeared. But the testimony remained. And centuries later, we are still telling their stories. This is why we remember the martyrs. Not to glorify violence, not to celebrate death, but to remember courage, to remember conviction, and to remember the people who refused to allow fear, to decide what they believed. Domitian thought persecution could silence Christianity, but Christianity survived. The empire changed. The emperors changed. The laws changed. The centuries changed. And still, the name of Jesus remained. John survived the persecution. Simeon did not. Timothy's death was remembered in later tradition. But each story carries the same question. What is faith worth? When faith costs everything. And perhaps, that question is not only for them. It is for us. Because persecution does not always begin with a sword. Sometimes, it begins with ridicule. Sometimes, with pressure. Sometimes, with fear. And sometimes, the hardest test of faith is not whether we would die for Christ. It is whether we are willing to live for Him when nobody is watching, when faith costs us comfort, when obedience is difficult. That is the legacy of the martyrs. They remind us that faith is more than words. Faith is conviction. Faith is endurance. Faith is remaining faithful. When everything around you tells you to surrender, Domitian is gone. His palace is gone. His empire is gone. But the question remains, if everything you had was taken away, would your faith remain? These were the Christians of the early church. They lived under emperors. They lived under threats. They lived under suspicion. But they kept gathering. They kept praying. They kept proclaiming Christ. And that is where our story ends. For now, because Domitian was not the final emperor to challenge the church, far greater storms were coming. More arrests, more executions, more martyrs. And some of the darkest days were still ahead. They refused to deny Christ. We refuse to let their stories be forgotten. This is the story of the Christian martyrs. And the next chapter will take us deeper into the blood-stained history of the early church.